Hi, friends. Welcome to Cultivate Your Mental Wealth, where I invite you on a journey to go from a place of mental illness to a place of mental wellness, and from a place of mental wellness to a place of mental abundance. As we know, when we operate in a place of abundance, we are able to give in the overflow, and our healing on this journey that we are both doing together, all of us, is not just for us, but it is also for communities and the people around us. And that's why we're not just settling with mental wellness, but we're going to abundance, because when we're able to live in the overflow, we're also able to give in the overflow, which is my favorite. So I want to introduce myself again to you, friends. My name is Joyce Chineye Ozeh. I am a Nigerian American civil rights attorney in Chicago. You can see the buildings behind me. I practiced disability rights law for 4 years, and now I practice civil rights law just more generally. I'm also a mental health care advocate, and I'm a woman with lived mental health experience. So, for the folks that were with us last time, you kind of know what that means. And if you weren't with us, do not worry. We are going into part 2 of my story. But before we get into that, I want to know who's watching with us. I want to know who's in the room. Feel free to drop your name, where you're watching from, and more importantly for me is what you are expecting from this mental health journey. Are you a person with lived experience? Are you a person who has a family member that's experiencing mental illness? Are you just curious? Are you someone who's a little bit nervous about the whole mental illness, mental health conversation, and you have some reservations? You are safe here. There is no judgment. There's a lot that goes into this discussion. And it's important that we're able to unpack it in an honest way. And that is why I'm sharing my story, because I can't be with you in this journey if you don't know where I'm coming from in this journey. So, before we go into my story, I would like to take a moment to just set the room. What do I mean by that? Well, like we've talked about on this show, we're going to have guest speakers, we'll have doctors, we'll have some of my girlfriends come in and talk about mental health and mental wellness. But more importantly, this is our conversation, okay? This is our journey together. This is an interactive, totally immersive experience. It's just us. What are your experiences with mental health? And each segment, I want to be able to have those conversations as it relates to the topic. And the topic today is our stories, our journeys, where we're at, diagnosis, what we're struggling with, what our family members are struggling with. So if at any point you want to jump in and share, I'm going to try my best to address any questions and conversations from a advocate standpoint and just invite you to the space. But I'm so happy to have you here. Tina, it's so nice to see you, hear from you. Thank you so much for joining today. And I hope that you are able to interact as you're able, ask questions, share. We're here for each other. Okay, so my story, again, why am I doing this? I believe that our stories are important, especially as Black people. I believe that for so long, our stories were not being told by us. And I believe that there is freedom in sharing your experience, right? There's freedom in talking about what you've been through and what you've been able to overcome. I have no shame in what I've experienced and what I've lived through, because I believe that it's all testimony. And I believe that this is how healing happens, when we're able to be honest, when we're able to pull down the curtain and say, this is what I'm struggling with, this is what I need. So this is why I'm sharing a little bit of my story. So if you were here last time, first of all, welcome back from the holiday. I know some of y'all don't celebrate Thanksgiving, but we celebrate family. I'm all about reclaiming spaces and words. I hope you had a great time with family or with yourself. And I hope that you ate real good and cooked well. So, before the holiday, I was just sharing my story and I talked about my childhood and how I was an anxious, kind of moody child. And I didn't really know why. I did experience a pretty serious trauma in my childhood. My dad died when I was 13 years old. But even before that, I was pretty prone to depression and anxiety. Of course, I didn't have the language for that. My parents are immigrants. I was born here, raised in the suburbs of Chicago. They certainly did not have the language for anxiety and depression. Their biggest goal was to survive, was to come to this country and start a life, to assimilate, to be successful so that their children had a fighting chance. So the idea of exploring mental health, depression, anxiety, those are all kind of luxuries growing up. And they didn't know how to identify it in me. And I don't blame them for that. But as I grew older, with my father's death at a young age, I did not take the time to mourn. I think a lot of the times as Black people, and especially as Black women, even as a little girl, I knew I was expected to be strong. I knew I was expected to kind of soldier through, be strong. I hate it when people feel bad for me. I hate being pitied. So I went to school the very next day after learning that my dad died. And then I went on to just try to get back to normal as quickly as possible without really experiencing and processing grief. Who has time to process grief when you're trying to excel in systems and in a country where you don't know where you fit or if you're made for those spaces? So processing grief felt like a luxury, and honestly, it felt like weakness. And it wasn't until I got to college, as I was saying before, that I realized I would be crying out of nowhere. I didn't know what was going on. And then I went to law school and I saw a counselor because it was free. And I'm like, we need to figure out what's happening. And I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder and major depression, which essentially means generally everything made me anxious. And my depression was pretty vast and profound. And my first response after finding out that was experiencing anxiety and depression was, I don't have time. I do not have time to have a mental illness. That was really my first response. I was a law student. I was one of the few Black law students in my class. My colleagues were in the library studying, and here's this therapist telling me that I need to slow down and meditate and think about the ocean or alternative ways of healing or consider a medication. And again, I'm a Black woman in this country. I don't have time to explore all these things. So for a while, I'm going to be honest, I was in kind of like denial. Can y'all relate to that? Where you're given a diagnosis or just anything, a label, anything that will shift your life, and you do not feel like you have the time to explore that, or you don't feel like you have the energy or the strength to confront that. That's what I felt. Who has time to have a mental illness? But here's the thing, it doesn't matter when it comes to your health, what you have time for, your mind or your body will slow down for you. So, whether you are intentional about making that time, which we'll get into a little bit, or whether you choose to ignore it, the tumor doesn't go away, the high blood pressure doesn't go away, and certainly the anxiety and the depression, which was I was running from, they don't go away. And all I knew is that I wanted to get to a place of wellness, but I didn't want to deal with this diagnosis. But like we talked about last time, you can't address what you don't confront. and you can't confront what you don't name. So, after some time, I had to name it. I had to name it. I had to name it with myself because, again, anxiety, depression, that's not something that I grew up hearing in my culture. That's not something that I was familiar with. But I'll tell you something really kind of unexpected. As soon as I named it anxiety, I actually felt a little bit lighter. It's as if to say, as soon as I was able to put a name to the issue, I was able to dream of the possibilities of coming out from under this thing. Because when you're living with mental illness, depression, anxiety that you're not familiar with, all you know is that everyone around you seems different than you, and you're under this cloud. You're under this cloud of grayness, of seriousness, of sadness, and you don't know why. You don't know why you're like this. You don't know what's wrong. And what I want to encourage us is not to be afraid of calling things by name. Don't ever be afraid or intimidated by the name of something, because once you're able to see it for what it is, then you can confront and address it. And that is the only time that healing and wellness happens. Hope, thank you so much for joining the conversation and giving a little shout out. We have another Columbus lady in the building and in the room. I'm so happy to have you with us in this space as I just share my story, why I'm here, and where I'm hoping we can all be. So I named it, y'all. I named it. I called it anxiety. And it kind of made me sick because, as we know, there are so many stigmas that come with not just being a woman, but being a Black woman with now this mental health diagnosis. That was really tough for me. It was really tough for me. But again, I just kind of started to get excited about the possibilities. So after naming it with myself, I named it with my family. Majella, thank you for joining the room. So happy to see you. It might be, oh, it's evening time over here too. So we welcome you to this space. And I'd love to know where you're calling from so I can give you a shout out. Also, as we're going along, feel free to ask questions about anything I'm sharing. I'll be as transparent as possible, or share any similar experiences with family members or even yourself. So I called my mommy and I told her I am living with anxiety and depression. And the first thing she told me was, don't say that. Don't say that. She told me not to call it by name. Don't put it in any of my applications for jobs. Let's just pray and we'll pray it away. Magella from Trinidad, so nice to have you. Thank you for sharing where you're from. And Tina, I really appreciate you saying that. For a while, I wasn't okay with being transparent with my story, but again, gone are the days where we are ashamed of where we've come from, and gone are the days where we hide our light under a bushel or a lampshade. I want you all to know where I've been, where I am, and where we are all going. So I appreciate you listening. And Sean from Detroit, thank you for coming to this space. So after my mom said, we're going to pray about it and don't call it out loud, it frustrated me because here I am fighting with this diagnosis, fighting to come to terms with this, to understand what this may mean for my life and my future. And my mom was afraid and didn't want to call it by name. But I knew that I had to confront this thing. So I made her say it. And I literally told her, I'm like, Mommy, I know that might be strange, but in my culture, we say mommy, daddy. We don't do mom and dad. But I told her, Mommy, say anxiety. I want you to say anxiety, say depression. I need you to call it for what it is. Because if you can also say it with me, you can understand why I'm the way that I am, why I get very irritable sometimes, or why I get very nervous and my heart starts pounding for simple things like her showing up without me letting me know, or answering an email, or why I have to go to my room and just shut off the lights and not answer my phone. So, in naming it for myself and inviting her, in fact, kind of forcing her to name it with me, it brought her along the journey with me so that she could learn how to support me, how to understand me. And if you're going to pray for someone, you better know how to pray for them. And a part of praying for them is calling where they are for what it is. Call it out. Call it out without shame. There is power in shedding light on darkness. And this mental illness was a darkness for me. So after processing it with myself first, then calling out my mama, processing it with her, I started to look at treatment options. And there was someone on here last week who was experiencing depression. And she said she was considering medication, but she wasn't sure. She was avoiding it. And I really understand that tension. I don't know how some of y'all are, but what are your feelings around medication? What are your feelings around just going to the doctor, speaking to them about treatment plans? Are you more of the person who likes to do holistic treatments? My mom's recipe for everything was eat some ginger, boil some water, take some lemon, drink some honey. And she's a nurse, but I grew up in a house that was not really pro medication. But I started to educate myself more and learn that there's a balance. But amen, Tina, I am with you. There is power in prayer. There is power in prayer. And sometimes the answer to prayer is therapy. Sometimes the answer to prayer is a doctor's office. I believe that God works miracles and heals in many different ways. And my mom tells a story about a man who was drowning, and God sent a lifeboat, God sent a helicopter, God sent a neighbor to help him out. But he's like, no, God's going to send me a miracle. When he passed away and got to heaven, he's like, God, where is my miracle? And God was like, I sent you a lifeboat, a neighbor, a helicopter, and you denied it. So it's all to say that the answer to prayer comes in many different ways. And I see some of you all saying that you're balanced. Some of you believe in prayer, holistic healing, medication. Hope, I see that you're saying that it's wonderful that you got your mom to listen, because a lot of people don't. You're currently on meds, and that doesn't address all the issues. Exactly. What a great segue into what I wanted to say. First, I was so blessed to have a mother who listened, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it or romanticize it. It was and still is a journey. I don't blame her. She's from a generation where mental illness is and was so stigmatized. So to have a daughter who's sick, that's not the kind of thing that you want to talk to your girlfriends with at brunch, So she was able to listen, but it was a process, and it definitely wasn't overnight. It took a lot of me honestly being patient and sometimes impatient, but me educating her so that she can help me in the journey, and not giving up on her, not getting too frustrated with her. Thank you so much for joining us, Miss Renee. I see that there's also medication for anxiety and depression, and you're not comfortable with it. I feel you. So I want to talk about some of my treatment stuff, because Miss Renee, I really relate to what you're saying. I denied medication for a long time because I'm like, I don't got time for this. I'm going to kumbaya first. Let me tell you, that didn't help. I've been a Christian my whole life, just to be transparent, but I believe that this conversation is for all of us. If you don't identify as Christian, that is fine. Mental illness is not discriminatory. It affects Christians, non-Christians, everybody. So let's still continue to have this conversation. But from my perspective, I wasn't getting any better by just ignoring it or not doing anything. So I talked to a doctor who told me, after I told her my symptoms, how often I had anxiety attacks. And with an anxiety attack, what it feels like is just doom. It could be the most trivial thing. I will never forget answering emails, and my heart would pound, and I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Y'all, there were days where I shared this last week. If I was able to get out of bed and take a shower for the day, and that was the only thing I did, I would be like, "You're doing great, Joyce. You're doing great. You're doing a great job." There were days where the only thing I can do is shower or eat some crackers or just something. Like, I had dishes everywhere. I had things all over the floor. I just wasn't doing well. But if you saw me in the street, it would look like this. And I'd be funny and charming and I would get my work done. I was a functioning sick person. People would never know what I was battling with behind closed doors because, again, I'm Black. I have to know how to put on a face and enter the Western world and perform because I didn't think I had the luxury or the time to be sick in a country where I'm trying to prove myself every single day. So no one knew what I was going through besides my mother. But I talked to my doctor and she said, I would never guess. She was, I think, an Iranian woman, Middle Eastern. I would never guess that this is what you're going through because of how you present yourself and the way that you talk. And you're a lawyer now and da 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 da. And she said, I never prescribe medication, but you, after hearing what you're going through, she's like, you need medication. And not just you need medication, you need to take 3 to 4 weeks off of work. I said, huh? By this time, I had graduated law school and I was practicing as an attorney. I believe I was 26 years old. And I said, that's out of the question. Can you imagine those of you who work full time, even taking a week off of work? Talk less of taking almost a month off because you're sick? Out of the question. So I ignored that for a while. And Sean, you're asking, what if someone refuses treatment no matter what you try? That was me. I was that someone. Patience is the biggest thing. My doctor was the only one I was talking to about treatment, and she was very patient with me. Now, mental illness is on a spectrum, and there are very different diagnoses. I center a lot of my work around depression and anxiety because it's what I've experienced, but I have close friends who are diagnosed with bipolar disorder, for example, and treatment and not being on treatment for them means mania. It means staying up for days on end. It means a lot of different things. So I'm a big believer in meeting someone where they're at in their journey and walking alongside of them. Meet them where they're at. Don't come from a paternalistic perspective, even if you are a parent. Talk to them about the benefits, walk alongside of them, help them clean their house if they need help, bring them lunch or bring them food, but build that relational currency where they know it's all love, no judgment. But if you are feeling unsafe, you can only do for them kind of what they're willing to do for themselves, but we can never force someone to wellness. Wellness is a decision that a person comes to on their own. So in the meantime, patience and prayer. Patience and prayer. So I tried treatment for a little bit. Medication just didn't really work with my body. I lost a ton of weight. I was jittery. I ended up taking 3 weeks off of work as a reasonable accommodation. I'll talk to you in a future segment about how to get accommodations at your job so that you're able to take time off of work while still keeping your job. especially if you're a person with a disability, you have a federal right to your employment as your job works with you to accommodate your disabilities. That will be a whole segment. My job was able to work with me, and the medication did not work for me. So what did I do? I cried. I found a new church in 2019. I told them my journey. And that was the first time I was ever told that I don't have to live with anxiety and depression. What medication for anxiety and depression does is it numbs you and it helps you cope, but it can never cure you because there's no medical cure for anxiety and depression. As someone who identifies as spiritual, as Christian, that don't add up. How can I be called to be free in Christ, but be bound by sickness? How can I be called to peace, a life of newness, abundance, and reform because of what Christ has done? But you're telling me that I'll always be sick and these drugs will only help me cope? It didn't add up. And that church that I went to, it's in Bronzeville, the City Light Church is in Chicago. They were like, there's another way. The only thing that worked for me was changing my old narrative and reprogramming my mind and speaking to my spirit. While I was doing this, I was no longer on medications. Again, I support medications as you're coping. But for me, it wasn't a long-term solution. It was a Band-Aid. I have tons of friends who are on antidepressants and anxiety medications. And I believe that there is a combination of things that can help us in our journey for wellness. So if you've been prescribed medications, continue in that. It just didn't work with me. But I wanted newness, I wanted a permanent solution, and I wanted freedom. So what I started doing was literally reprogramming my mind. Lynetta, thank you for joining us, and amen. I realized that I don't have to be who I've always been. I was always the sick girl, the sad girl, the anxious girl. But God has called me joy. God has called me free. God has called me to peace. God has called me to abundance. God says he exchanges my sorrow for newness and for joy. So if I'm not experiencing that joy, something's wrong. Something is wrong in the promise. And I know that every spiritual promise is mine. So it's on me to access those promises. How did I do that? I told myself a new narrative. I divorced myself from this image of being the sad, depressed girl. Even when I was sorrowful, I was calling myself a new name. So I started to speak out loud to myself, and I'm going to go through some affirmations at the end of the show. But it's all about knowing your identity and calling yourself by that identity. Even when I was the most sick, my mom reminded me of my name, Joyce. And she would tell me, you are the rejoicing of your Father. Heaven rejoices when heaven sees you. You bring light and love to every room. Meanwhile, I was not light and I was not love. But she spoke to me not as she saw me, but as God sees me and who she hoped I would be. And when I was strong enough through therapy, I love therapy. And I had a lot of therapy for about 2 to 3 years. I was in therapy with a Black woman, and it was powerful because I was able to process this new identity through therapy, through community, through my church, and being able to serve. I was no longer waking up every day and thinking about how I was feeling. I was thinking about what can I give? How can I serve? And that brought newness to my mind. It brought me freedom. And I would say within 5 to 6 months of joining a community and speaking affirmations, I was no longer experiencing panic attacks. And I was no longer having trouble getting out of bed and experiencing debilitating depression. It was not overnight. It took reprogramming, but it was possible. So that's just like some of my story. I'm going to share more of my story as we go along, but I want to let you know that on Tuesday, December 27th, we are going to be back with a new segment of our show where we're talking about mental wellness and how we deal with mental wellness around the holidays. Statistics show that mental illness is exacerbated when people experience the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Kwanzaa, New Year's. It's really tough on people. How do we process that? How do we deal with that? How do you go about that? Join me Tuesday, December 7th, same time, same place for that conversation, and bring your questions. But now we're going to go into one of my favorite parts of our conversation in this segment, and that is where we practically push towards mental wellness. And I'm going to share with you some practical pushes towards wellness. So I hope you like that transition. Did you know that when you speak out loud, it actually impacts your brain functions, your emotions, how you see yourself? Yes. When I'm talking about affirmations, I'm not just talking about these like kumbaya, hippie things that you do. I'm saying what actually impacted and changed my mind. It is scientifically proven that speaking out loud changes your brain function because you are able to hear things and it impacts the way your brain receives information. So let's walk through some of my favorite affirmations that helped me in cultivating my mental wealth and cultivating a new narrative, a new identity for myself that was based in the spirit and in the promises of God. So, this is literally what I said to myself back then and what I still speak to myself. Let's start. I am renewed. I am joy. I am perfect peace. I am abundant. I am chosen. I am liberated. I am complete. I am beloved. And my favorite, I am God's poem. I'm God's poetry. All of those are actually based in scripture. So it's not just stuff that I plucked out of the sky. But if you want to write your own affirmations, I encourage you to do so. This is my practical push. Go in these next 2 weeks, write 3 affirmations that you want to speak out loud for yourself every single day. And it doesn't matter whether you feel that it's true, believe that it is true. This is what I have for you, friends. Thank you for joining this space, and I encourage you to go thrive.